The black night enveloped Hong Kong, China. Heavy raindrops began to fall, tapping steadily on the corrugated iron roofs, on the glass windows of the tall buildings. In the dim glow of the streetlights hid stories that not everyone wanted to hear, gruesome secrets buried beneath the glamorous facade of a city that never sleeps. Tonight, we will together trace the footsteps of one of the most haunting cases in Hong Kong's history, a case that turned an ordinary taxi driver into a perpetrator of extreme horror. X was a taxi driver, a familiar figure on the late-night streets, but few knew that within that person was an abyss full of obsessions. Lam Kor-wan, a name now synonymous with terror. He grew up in solitude, a difficult childhood believed to have sown the seeds of his psychological disorders. Imagine a child having to face violence from a very early age, growing up in isolation, lacking love and social connection. That loneliness, like a catalyst, may have turned private hobbies into an obsession, an uncontrollable urge. Lam Kor-wan, born in 1955, grew up in Malaysia before moving to Hong Kong. He lived with his father, stepmother, and younger brother in a dilapidated apartment. Lam Kor-wan had no girlfriend, his social life was almost non-existent. His only pleasure revolved around clandestine adult magazines ordered from abroad because he was too ashamed to buy them publicly. When he grew tired of this pastime, Lam Kor-wan bought a camera and began secretly taking pictures in women's restrooms. However, this behavior did not last long, as he was discovered during one of his peeping sessions and was chased and beaten by a group of angry women. Frightened, Lam Kor-wan abandoned this deviant pastime, only to commit even more terrifying acts. In 1973, Lam Kor-wan used a knife to threaten a young girl near a public toilet, with the intent of committing a depraved act. As a result, he was arrested by the police. However, a psychological examination revealed that Lam Kor-wan suffered from a mental illness, so he was fortunate enough to avoid any punishment. Lam Kor-wan was ordered to go to Castle Peak Hospital for psychological treatment and was released after 102 days. Lam Kor-wan had been arrested for taking illicit photos, had undergone psychological treatment. These were warning signs, weren't they? But who could have guessed that this was just the prelude to a series of gruesome crimes that were about to happen? He was a patient predator, waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for the pouring rainy nights when the streets were deserted and unsuspecting victims entered his taxi. In February 1982, a horrific event occurred, marking the beginning of a tragic chain. Chan Fong Lan, 22, a nightclub dancer, disappeared without a trace. This first murder, according to Lam Kor-wan's testimony, was not meticulously planned. Around 4 a.m. on February 3, 1982, Lam Kor-wan picked up a heavily intoxicated woman named Chan Fong Lan, leaving a restaurant on Tsim Sha Tsui Road. While in the taxi, Miss Chan Fong Lan made Lam Kor-wan stop so she could vomit on the roadside, then repeatedly changed her destination, one moment insisting on returning to the bar, a few minutes later demanding to go somewhere else. Provoked beyond endurance, Lam Kor-wan drove to a deserted area and strangled Chan Fong Lan to death with an electrical wire. This was Lam Kor-wan's first murder, and although it was not planned, he later took the victim's body home to hide it. It was 5 a.m., the streets were deserted, and he calmly brought the body into his home without being detected. Lam Kor-wan hid the victim's body under the sofa and went to bed as if nothing had happened. In the morning, after waiting for everyone in his family to leave for work, Lam Kor-wan spread a large nylon sheet on the floor to dismember the victim's body and began taking photographs. He then wrapped each part separately, put them in the trunk of his car, and dumped them into the Xingmun River. Preliminary forensic evidence indicated that the remains of flesh and bone belonged to a woman. Judging from the level of decomposition, she had been dead for about a week. However, no personal belongings of the deceased were found at the scene, and the face on the skull was obscured, so the identity of the deceased remained a mystery. The only clue was a very distinctive tattoo on her arm, featuring a dagger piercing a red heart in the middle, a flying swallow in the lower right corner, and colorful ribbons wrapped around the red heart. In the 6 months that followed, 3 more victims fell into his hands, one after another: Chun Wan-kit, Lam Kor-wan, 29, and Lam Wai-sung, 17. Each case was a new page in the Black Book of Brutality, but they all shared gruesome characteristics. The victims were all women who worked in bars. The method of killing was identical. All took place on rainy, windy nights, and parts of their bodies were kept by him. In the early morning of May 29th, after finishing her night shift at 5:20 a.m., cashier Chun Wan-kit caught a taxi to go home amidst heavy rain. Little did she know it would be a fateful ride. Taking advantage of a deserted stretch of road, driver Lam Kor-wan suddenly subdued, handcuffed, and then murdered the victim. Many parts of her body were later found disposed of on the hillsides of Taichung. Next, on June 17th, Lam Kor-wan, a nightclub waitress, met a similar fate after leaving work and catching Lam's taxi. This time, Lam videotaped the entire process of dismembering the victim. To do this, Lam placed the camera on a bunk bed, using a self-recording function to capture all of his actions. Freed from having to hold and adjust the camera, Lam's actions in this case were also incredibly brutal, and the victim's body parts were discarded in the Taichung culvert. The third victim was identified as Lam Wai-sung, a female student who was only 17 years old. Imagine the haunting fears of families with missing loved ones, the terror of women who had to return home late from work, not knowing if the approaching taxi was a death trap. The entire city was plunged into an atmosphere of extreme fear. What key clue finally broke the case and exposed the killer? It was a slip-up in the murder of the young girl Lam Wai-sung that helped the police capture him. Finally, Lam Kor-wan's brutality had to come to an end. When Lam Wai-sung got into the taxi, Lam Kor-wan quickly handcuffed her. He did not act immediately, but drove her around for several hours, casually talking about everything under the sun, from family and studies to religion and beliefs. At 4 a.m., when the girl fell asleep from exhaustion, he strangled her to death and took her body home. By this time, the terror he had spread had earned Lam Kor-wan a gruesome nickname from the people of Hong Kong: Rainy Night Butcher. Because he couldn't develop photos at home, he was forced to take the film rolls of his victims to a photo shop to be developed. When the shop owner questioned him about the photos of human body parts, Lam Kor-wan claimed that he was a laboratory assistant at a university and that these images were for medical research purposes. However, on August 17, 1982, a gut feeling told the photo shop owner that something was unusual, that the photos looked too much like a serious criminal case. He decided to report it to the police. The very next day, when Lam Kor-wan went to the photo shop to pick up the pictures, he was arrested by the police and taken straight to his home, to the utter astonishment of his father and younger brother. It didn't take long for the police to easily find an old iron box under the bed. Inside were explicit photos and, more notably, 2 bottles carefully sealed with tape, containing other gruesome evidence. On April 3, 1983, Lam Kor-wan was convicted of murdering 4 people and sentenced to death by hanging, but this was later commuted to a life sentence. Examining Lam Kor-wan's entire photo archive, the police discovered at least 15 different female bodies, but to this day they have only identified 4 victims. The other bodies remain a mystery. What is most terrifying is his coldness, his lack of emotion. He showed no remorse even looking down on the lives of his victims, considering them useless to society. The story of Lam Kor-wan is not just a simple murder case. It is a chilling warning about the dark corners of the human psyche, about how childhood trauma can turn an individual into a brutal murderer. It is also a reminder about vigilance, about listening to the warning bells, no matter how small. Now, as we look back at this story, do you feel a shiver? Have you ever wondered what truly turned an ordinary taxi driver into such a horrifying rainy night butcher?